Do you enjoy listening to podcasts and think, man, I would like to make my own podcast? This is where I found myself last year, and I have learned a lot about what to do and a lot about what not to do. I'm offering consulting services to help you launch your podcast, especially if you're looking to make a more Christian or conservative based podcast. Find out more information at faithfullyengaged.com. I have a link down in the description below if you would like help on getting your podcast started. Well, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Faithfully Engaged. Today, we're going to be talking about freedom, and more specifically about ways that we can speak for freedom. I've got a guest that knows all about that, and his name is Michael Gladkoff. So, Michael, it's nice to have you on. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Johnny. Yeah, I'm a speechwriter and copywriter, editor, and I've been doing this professionally since 2005. Before that, I worked in publishing and advertising, going back to the mid-'80s, and originally got interested in speech writing in the mid-'80s when I joined Toastmasters. And since then, I've written hundreds of speeches for myself and for clients, including business, government, and education. And another aspect that I've always been interested in is history and freedom. And one of the reasons is my dad was born in the Soviet Union, and he escaped at the end of World War II and came to the United States. I now live in Australia. Met my wife when I was living in Alaska, and we moved over here in 1999. But with all that, background, the history and everything, I really got interested in freedom. And one big event in my life was in 1980. I was in high school, and Ronald Reagan was speaking the night before the election, and he spoke in San Diego at of all places, a parking lot of a shopping center. And my friend and I went down there and saw him speak, and that really made a big impact on me. And I saw how the economy, just the whole feeling of society, the whole attitude changed during the 80s, late 70s during Jimmy Carter was very down and depressing and unoptimistic, and it all changed. So I saw the importance of having strong leadership and a focus on freedom for people in a society, less government involvement. So over the years, I've been studying the concepts of capitalism, freedom, and also persuasion. So that led me to write Speaking for Freedom, which is a book about how to promote freedom. And I deal with all aspects of that, from if you're speaking, how to connect with an audience, how to use humor, how to use figures of speech, persuasive language, how to end with a strong call to action. All those things that if you're speaking on a speech, a video, a TV program, whatever, even writing an article or blog, you can use those concepts in that. And I have it on my website, Speaking for.
Great. Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting to hear when people talk about freedom, especially in the United States. It's such a big, like, just part of our culture. We don't even really think about it that much.
Yeah.
But it's great to hear the personal connection there for you, for your dad, your family. That wasn't just some nebulous concept. Like, this is big stuff. So I can see why that was so personal for you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I didn't know a lot of that history when I was growing up. I got up bits and pieces, but like my grandfather, he was a composer, and he was born in 1898, and he fought in the Russian Civil War against the communists. And they basically, when the communists took over, they basically lost everything. His parents they were sort of middle class. They were opera singers before the revolution, and they lost everything, just for being productive and not agreeing with the government at the time. So that really showed me that it's unfortunate, but we got to really protect that wherever we live, whether it's in United States, Australia, the UK. And I think that's we're losing sight of that now with what governments are doing around the world. And in Australia, they're trying to have it's really bad, a misinformation bill, and they can decide what is misinformation. So it's really scary about what's going on. And one of my things I like to do is speak up against that.
Yeah, no, especially like you're saying in Australia. That's something that uh, I know a lot of people were pretty surprised, especially during some COVID policies and things like that. Like, oh, the freedom stuff that doesn't happen in any Western countries, but clearly that's not the case. Unfortunately, there are cases like this misinformation bill, like you're talking about, where freedom can really be in peril.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And one of the things I talk about in my book is I give historical examples. So I have things from the past, and I look at the great speakers. So, for instance, looking at Winston Churchill, some of his speeches during World War II, and some of the techniques he used. People like Abraham Lincoln, going back, his great strength was his language and the simplicity of his language, and also looking at the influence of what made these people great speakers. And in the case of Lincoln, for example, he was a reader of the King James Bible from an early age, and they grew up with that, and they heard that being read in their homes, and that's really one of the cornerstones of the English language. Also, Shakespeare. Lincoln was a great lover of Shakespeare, and he could recite, long passages from Shakespeare, and that's another thing that made him a great speaker. Looking back at Churchill, he developed those skills in his education. The education at the time when he was young in England was a lot better of things of rhetoric and how to use language effectively. And Ronald Reagan, my next book is going to be about his speeches, and he became a great speaker from the same. He was an actor from an early age. He acted on stage. His family was mother was very religious, so he's also exposed to the King James Bible, and that influenced him, as well as doing other things like being a radio announcer. And he loved to study and read, and that's another thing that I focus on is really, if you want to speak and write and be persuasive, we need to be knowledgeable.
It's really interesting from that biblical perspective how, again, it's another thing, especially in the United States, that Christianity, although not maybe as big as it once was in the country, is still by far the dominant religion, and especially where I'm
Mm.
at in the southern United States and Oklahoma,
Yeah, yeah.
where it's just very, very cultural. We don't think about religion as being as big of a deal just because it's just so ingrained here. It's just part of the culture.
Right.
What
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
what is it about, yeah, like Abraham Lincoln and some of these big speakers, the huge influential figures? What was it about scripture, in this case King James Bible? Why was that so important for them, or so influential for them in their speaking?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because I have a short presentation that answers that question. Not all. No, I don't give all the examples, but I look at some of the big ways of how that influences the way people speak, and that's through figures of speech. And I'll just go ahead and share my screen
Yeah.
and get into that and share some examples with you. Yeah, and I call this Figures for Freedom. And this is a presentation that I give to political groups, but I use different examples from that. I can, sometimes I use examples from advertising as well. And I also give this presentation with different examples in the advertising industry. And I spoke at the largest advertising and marketing convention in Australia. So, Figures for Freedom, just I talk about figures of speech and figures of speech in history. With the rise of the Greek democracy, rhetoric became a high art. It was studied and then developed systematically. And Aristotle wrote his book Rhetoric that talks about this. And the ancient Greeks talked about these techniques of language, and they named them. That's why most of them have Greek names that we use today. Then I'll be sharing a few of these with you. And these come in two main forms: are schemes and tropes. Now, schemes are a way of using language, the order of words, so we can change words, the way, either repeating them, omitting, balancing, or changing word order. And tropes are more things like metaphors, similes, analogies. And I'll talk today just about a few schemes of repetition. In particular, I'll talk about six. They're alliteration, anadiplosis, anaphora, epistrophe, epizeuxis, and polyptoton. So alliteration is a figure of speech, meaning beginning with the same letter in Latin. It's when you use the same letter to start a sentence, phrase, clause. And here's an example from Barry Goldwater from one of his speeches in the early 1960s. And he said, "We are plotting at a pace set by a centralized planning, red tape, rules without responsibility, and regimentation without recourse." So you can see all the repetition of the P sounds in the beginning and then the R sounds later in that sentence. Another one that I like is from Charlton Heston, who said, "By daring to put on parchment what our founding fathers felt, deep in the hearts, the long, silent soul of liberty rose up from a commoner's dream to become every man's birthright." So we see that the P, put on parchment, founding fathers felt, and silent soul of all examples of alliteration. Example from Paul's epistle to the Hebrews. We see all these. We see quite a few. I won't read them all, but finding fault, flame of fire, the grace of God, harden your hearts, higher than the heavens, holy, harmless, labor of love, made manifest, made mention, morsel of meat. So you can see how if you're reading this every day as a child and growing up, it's going to influence how you speak. And that's how I talk about people like Lincoln and other people from the past who were influenced by this writing. It's also found a lot in Shakespeare, these types of figures of speech. So it did influence the way people wrote and spoke, even subconsciously, by being influenced by it so much. Another one that I talk about is anadiplosis, and that's when you repeat the last word of a phrase or clause at the beginning of the next one. So Aristotle said masculine republics give way to feminine democracies, and feminine democracies give way to tyranny. So you have the feminine democracies repeated at the end and beginning of subsequent clauses. Another one from Margaret Thatcher: "Without a healthy economy, we can't have a healthy society, and without a healthy society, the economy won't stay healthy for long." So the healthy society repeated there. And Judge Clarence Thomas: "If you lie, you will cheat. If you cheat, you will steal. If you steal, you will kill." So those cheat, steal, being repeated at the beginning and end of subsequent clauses. A few examples of anadiplosis from the Bible. "And the ark went upon the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly." And then "He who is sowing sparingly, sparingly also shall reap, and he who is sowing blessings, and blessings also shall reap." So you see in the first one, the waters being repeated. In the second one, sparingly and blessings being repeated in the form called anadiplosis. Anaphora is when you repeat the beginning a few words at the beginning of a phrase or clause. And a very famous one is from Winston Churchill at the end of his speech after the defeat of the British in France, using "we shall," repeating "we shall" at the beginning of those phrases or clauses. And that's probably one of the most memorable speeches from World War II, because repetition is a way for us to learn. It's also a way for us to remember. And it's interesting. I was talking to a pastor recently, and he said he grew up with the traditional King James Bible, and he started reading more modern versions, but he remembers the older versions because these techniques are more memorable, because our minds, grab onto patterns and connect with patterns, and we can remember patterns more easily. Another one from Patrick Buchanan: "That's change, all right, but that's not the kind of change America needs. It's not the kind of change America wants, and it's not the kind of change we can abide by in a nation we still call God's country." So not the kind of change is repeated there in the form of anaphora. And here's some examples. Here's one from Isaiah. I won't read out the whole thing, but you can see how it's "woe unto them, woe unto them, and woe unto them." It's repeated 3 times in that form of way of repeating at the beginning of a phrase or clause. And here's a very famous one, of course, that it's very memorable, and that's from the Sermon on the Mount, and using "blessed" repeatedly, in this case, several times. And that's very memorable, very repeatable. And that's how these types of phrases have influenced the way people spoke and have written since the time they were published. Epistrophe is when you repeat the same word or group of words at the end of successive clauses or phrases. So Frederick Douglass said, to ensure good behavior, the slaveholder relies on the whip. To induce proper humility, he relies on the whip. To rebuke what he is pleased to term insolence, he replies on the whip. To supply the places of wage as an incentive to toil, he relies on the whip. So relies on the whip is repeated at the end of each phrase there. And here's one from the King James Bible. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. So as a child is repeated there 3 times in a form of epistrophe. It's also using what's called the rule of 3 or trikolon, which I won't speak about today. It's when you use 3 elements, and that's probably the most common figure of speech that's used really anywhere. It's very powerful. It's to use 3 elements of something. And here's some examples from the Bible. O Israel, trust thou in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. O house of Aaron, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. Ye that fear the Lord, trust the Lord. He is their help and their shield. So epistrophe in that case is he is their help and their shield, which is here repeated 3 times. Epizeuxis, it's a simple form of repetition where you repeat a word successively at least twice. So Winston Churchill said, never give in, never, 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 never. And nothing great or small, large or petty, never give in except to convictions of honor and good cause. And Margaret Thatcher said, if a nation has spent, and spent again, ours has. And here's a few examples from the Bible of epizeuxis. I create the fruit of the lips. Peace, peace to him who is far off and to him who is near, says the Lord, and I will heal him. And from John, and he saith unto him, verily, verily, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see heaven upon the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. So you have verily, verily in the second one, and peace, peace in the first one. Polyptoton is when you repeat a word that's derived from the same root, but it's not exactly the same word. So from Shakespeare, 2 gentlemen of Verona, unheedful ways may heedfully be broken. So heedful is the word there. And from Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you have the word absolute and absolutely repeated in 2 different forms of the same root of the word. And from the Bible, I have been a stranger in a strange land. Judge not, yet ye be not judged. And but evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. So in the first one, stranger and strange land, and judge and judged. And in the third one, deceiving and being deceived. And the funny thing is, like the stranger in the strange land, I saw one, different version saying, I've been a foreigner in a strange land. And although that might be closer to the original meaning, it's just not as powerful as I have been a stranger in a strange land. So I think that really shows the power of the language when you look at those techniques. So just to be a brief review, I'll just wrap up there with this. But alliteration is when we repeat initial consonants, letters, or sounds in at least 2 words in successive sentences, clauses, or phrases. Anadiplosis is when you repeat the last word of one phrase, clause, or sentence at the beginning of the following phrase, clause, or sentence. Anaphora is when you emphasize a word or words by repeating it at the beginning of adjacent clauses or sentences. Epistrophe is when you repeat the same word or words at the end of successive clauses or sentences. Epizeuxis is a simple form of repetition where you repeat words consecutively. And polyptoton is when you repeat words derived from the same root. And I teach this part. It's just one part of what I teach in the book. persuasive communications, clear and simple writing. I talk about Lincoln Menzies, who was the Prime Minister of Australia in the 50s and 60s, and George Orwell. Storytelling, Reagan and Charlton Heston. Modes of persuasion, Aristotle. Creating connections, Solzhenitsyn. Opening and closing speeches, Margaret Thatcher. Humor, H.L. Mencken, Churchill, and Reagan. If you want to find out more, I have about 35 of these figures of speech in my book. So here we covered 6. You can find it at speakingforfreedom.com. Also, these are my social media handles. I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Truth Social, and you can find the book on Amazon. And if you want the presentation, just go to my website and check it out. You can email me at inspire at speakingforfreedom.com. And I will share that presentation with you. I know it's a lot to absorb in the short time. I just sort of ran through that in 15 minutes, but you can see how it takes a long time to learn all those. And if you're not exposed to those, especially these days, you're probably not going to learn those in school. But someone like Winston Churchill would study those, and Lincoln picked them up by reading King James Bible and Shakespeare. And I also teach these to the advertising industry, because a lot of the advertising slogans and brand names are based upon these. And I teach around 40 of these to advertising companies.
It's interesting that you bring up that.
I know I'm not. Yeah.
I was just going to say,
ahead.
it's interesting you bring up the advertisement side of things. I'm thinking through in my education and everything. I know I've heard alliteration. I think most people have.
Yeah.
And those other ones, it's not like I haven't seen it, but I don't think I've ever heard the definition or thought about it as much. But yeah, I loved the biblical examples because you can definitely see that in Old Testament, New Testament, all over the place. But the advertisement, like you said, that's when you just said that. I hadn't thought about it during the presentation, but you're absolutely right. I can quickly point to ads where you hear that same word over and over, or in groups like that, like advertisers want you to hear what they want you to hear or see or whatever it may be. So that's really interesting that you tie that into advertisement, because that makes a lot of sense.
Right. Yeah. And I have hundreds. I've been collecting examples from advertisement, and that's one of the things that I do. I teach advertising companies how to do this. So if anyone is in advertising or marketing, can also get in touch with me. It's different content because I use different examples, of course. So like example, just off the top of my head, there's something called antithesis, the opposite, and we can see that from a time to sow, a time to reap, from Ecclesiastes, the famous passage. A time to build, a time to tear down. And one I like from Apple, one of their computer ads was beast inside, beauty outside. So they show a picture of one of their computers, one of their large computers. It says beast inside. It's really strong and it's very beautiful outside. So that's a double antithesis. We're using beast and beauty and inside and outside. So I talk about, and you can combine them as well. That makes it even more powerful. When you combine several figures of speech. So you might have like an afro plus the rule of 3, where you do it 3 times, or there's all kinds of way to combine it. There's a famous ad campaign in Australia because there was high cancer rates, and it's called slip, slop, slap. Slip on a shirt, slap on some sunscreen, and slip on a hat and slap on some sunscreen. And that uses 3 figures of speech. It's alliteration. Onomatopoeia is when you make sounds that sound like actual noises. And the rule of 3. So they're combining 3 of those figures of speech in that slogan that came out in the 80s. And it really changed people's behavior, and it reduced the amount of skin cancer in Australia dramatically. So, something as simple as that. and it really changes people's behavior. And if you could use that effectively in speeches, political slogans, brand names. But that's really just one aspect of what I talk about. Like I said before, when I talk about speeches and presentations and making videos, I talk about things about like connecting at the beginning, ending strongly, using humor. Like using humor, I have a whole chapter in my book, and I use a lot of examples from Ronald Reagan, who was really probably the most humorous political speakers in I'd say the last 100 years. Churchill was a bit funny, but he was funny in a different way, and he didn't really do that in his main speeches. It was more, talking off the cuff or in small groups. Same with Lincoln. Lincoln was a great storyteller when he was in a small group of people, like his cabinet, or if people came to the White House. But in it, his speeches were more, solemn and serious because of what was going on at the time. But did have a great sense of humor. Thatcher was, a bit funny as well. And another someone I heard speak maybe 5 years ago from the U.S. is Arthur Laffer, who's an economist, was an economist during the Reagan years, and he's a very good humorous speaker. It's really hard to pull off in politics, I think, is being funny. Being funny when you're talking about serious topics, but a few people have done it very well.
I this is really just my own my own anecdotes, as well as maybe just some stereotypes. I don't know if it's necessarily true or not, but at least in my time frame, you bring up Reagan, which I was, well, I was going to say I was born during Reagan years, but I actually wasn't. I was born just slightly out of Reagan being in the
Oh,
White
okay.
House.
So you don't remember that? That's fine. Yeah, yeah.
So certainly I've heard speeches, and it's one of those things where I can go back in time and look at that, and it's really neat. But I don't have that. I don't have that personal experience. I didn't listen to those live, and in my
Exactly. Yeah.
time frame, whether truth or stereotype, it seems to have been for a good chunk of time that the Republican or conservative is just the businessmen in suit and tie. They're boring and dry, and
Yeah.
they don't matter. Whereas the Democrat, I think of, well, it's probably not the best example in the White House right now. Not the best orator we have in there right now, but
Yeah.
certainly
Yeah. Yeah.
Obama
Right.
was very connecting, good speaker.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Tend to see that more on the left. Even a Bernie Sanders type can really connect with the younger crowd and everything.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything to that as far as modern conservatives maybe not tapping into speaking as well as maybe some of the left has?
That's funny because like Obama, the last things I talked about, those techniques, he uses tons of those in his speeches. I've gone through, and actually I gave a long time, well, 2009, I gave a presentation to the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia about his speeches, and I sort of talked about these techniques that I just talked about today. And it was like a breakfast, training thing. And it was one of the most popular ones they've ever done. So I talked about that, and I didn't really, talk about it from a political standpoint, for or against, but I just talked about what he was doing. And the funny thing is that, yeah, I think you're right, because I was visiting my family in the U.S. in September this year, and I reached out to like 20 Republican groups like a few months before, like young Republicans and women Republicans and different groups, and I told them, I have these techniques I can teach you guys. Or come over for free, even if like a day or half a day, and teach you these techniques of speaking and persuasion. But nobody even got back to me. It's just like disappointing. So I don't think they're serious about learning these. Unless maybe some people at the higher level would know this. But the more people that know these techniques, I mean, throughout the organization, you could crowdsource or do like a hackathon and create slogans, taglines, really powerful language if you know these. But yeah, I don't think they're as concerned about persuasion.
Hmm.
They're more concerned about raising money, at this point. So it was a bit disappointing, the kind of response that I got from various groups.
Yeah, I could definitely see that being something that more grassroots campaigns, local campaigns. That's something that I've been big on lately with just as far
Yeah.
as the political scape goes, like a presidential election, things of that nature. They obviously matter, but local politics really matters as well. And I could see something like that as far as making an impact. Maybe you don't have a big political background or a bunch of money or whatever, but if you can speak well and get your community to go around you, you really could make a pretty big difference.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting you say that because when I volunteered to speak at these various groups, the only one that took me up was a like a local group in Pasadena, California, and we met outside at had like a barbecue area, like a park. So I gave I gave a longer version of the presentation I gave here. I gave it outside in the park, and they're more like a grassroots, not really officially party affiliated group. So I think in that respect, yes, they're really, because when you don't have a lot of money, you need to really leverage what you're doing strongly. So you need to really understand how persuasion works, about these, having a good slogan or tagline or very effective speaking or videos. So in that case, the knowledge is more important than the money if you don't have a lot of money. But I guess the people that have a lot of money, just they can just spend it, so they're not really that concerned about the techniques or the knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. And it goes back into a big piece of why I just made this podcast in general. It's easy to get disheartened by, like, if I'm a hardcore conservative of the Republicans are doing this and I don't like what they're doing, and that's
Yeah, yeah.
discouraging. And I don't. I'm not saying to not feel that way. I think it's sometimes it's good to express that frustration, but what happens is we just get lost in that frustration. We're mad, we're upset.
Yeah, yeah.
So then I become apathetic and I just sit back and watch the world burn. And that's not what we need to do. We need to be active. We need to do things to make a difference around us. And I think that's part of why your persuasion techniques, things like that, of looking at historical figures. Yeah, maybe you're not going to be the next Abe Lincoln, but can you make a difference in your community, in your family, in your job? Like, we don't want to just sit back and be mad all the time.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that's why I called it. I called it speaking for freedom. I didn't call it speaking for Republicans or any particular group. And I look at history. I do have people in there, but I have different parties. I talk about Martin Luther King Jr. I have some quotes by JFK when he was speaking out against communism. So it's not really a party thing. It's more just about
Mhm.
freedom. So I wanted to really create a big tent with my thing. So I have like libertarians that are interested in these concepts. It's not really just for one group or one party. So I think you're right in that respect, that grassroots wise, we don't need to be affiliated with something really big, but we can make a difference on a small
Yeah.
scale. And the techniques that I teach in my book and during presentations is one way to do that.
I am curious after going through that presentation, and I know we just hit a small amount there. There's a lot more to cover out there. For
Yeah,
somebody
yeah.
that's maybe they're not necessarily going to go into politics or to be a big speaker or whatever, but they just want to be more persuasive, maybe even with their boss or just in a local group that they run or
hmm
something. What would be a good place for them to start, just to get their feet wet and becoming a little more persuasive?
For me, I spent years in Toastmasters, which is a very sort of low key group. It's not really political at all. You're not supposed to talk about politics, but what they do is you join and you start with a simple program. It's called the Competent Communicator, and you give 10 presentations. Like the first one is talking about yourself. The one is talking about how to use gestures. Another one might be how to use language effectively. So going through these 10 speeches, you gain those important skills. And that's a good way to do that, just to get started. And it's very friendly environment where people mentor each other and coach each other. It's not high pressure. usually. And there's business clubs, corporate clubs, and local clubs in the communities, and you could probably find one wherever you live. You can probably find one within a few minutes of where you live. So that's good as well. The other thing is just reading and knowing, being knowledgeable. And like my book in particular, it's more about the content, like how to create strong content. There's other things like how to get up on stage, how to overcome nervousness, how to use body language. Those are all important things. But I deal with powerful words and language and how to apply those. So if you're giving a speech, like I said before, how to open and close, be funny, use language, humor, and so in that respect, that's one thing you can do. But really, to get out there, I recommend that, or even just volunteering to speak if there's something you feel strongly about a topic. I always recommend, at least writing an outline, not just trying to get up and ad lib, but writing an outline of what you want to talk about until you become more comfortable with it. And if you have really an important speech with hundreds of people, I would say write it down verbatim. Write it down, even if you don't deliver it that exact way on the day. And if you're good at memorizing, that's great. But having those notes in front of you and just having an outline is important to organize your ideas, so you're not jumping around. And one thing I recommend to people that are subject matter experts, so if you feel strongly about a subject and you know a lot about it, is write a strong opening and conclusion in the middle part that you know a lot about. Just have an outline for that. If it's a longer presentation, like half an hour or something, you don't have time to write out half an hour worth of text. That's one thing I give advice on that way.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense on both fronts. One, we need to get some practice, and ideally in some of these more low pressure situations where we can get some feedback, and there's not
Yeah.
thousands of people staring at us when we're giving a
Mm-hmm.
speech to practice. But also, yeah, reading, getting more knowledge, even like you point out in your book, just all these examples. And I think that's something that's great too of today, that like I said, I've listened to some Ronald Reagan speeches and I wasn't even alive. Like there's all sorts of content out there
Mm-hmm.
on YouTube and different things. And yeah, I think just soaking that in, and then like you're saying, something that really stuck out to me when you're talking about writing stuff out, um my pastor, he's very very knowledgeable, and I about
Mm-hmm.
guarantee you he could go up there on Sunday and speak without there being anything and do a great job, and most people
Yeah.
probably wouldn't notice a lot. But he
Mm-hmm.
he diagrams like it all out. He's got the whole thing written out there, and you can tell
Yeah.
that he's just
Yeah.
so comfortable with what he's saying, and he's able to let more emotion out and things like that, because he's not up there worried about what he's going to say or just winging it. Like he's got it out there, and he's a very skilled speaker in that way.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, like you said, he's might not have it written down word for word, but he knows the order and what he's going to say before he gets up there. So that's very helpful. And he's very knowledgeable as well. So when he wants to speak on a certain topic, he can probably pull a quote out from memory, or a story just that he knows. So that's very important. That's what I said, like reading, studying, learning. The more knowledgeable you are, like the more I read, I have ideas for books in the future, but the more I read, the more ideas I come up with, and almost to a point where I can organize them in my head. Like I want to do this, or I want to do this speech. So by having more information coming in, I have more of a foundation for good content going out as well. And I think
Yeah.
just that makes a big difference.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a lot of it, kind of bringing a Christian bent on this with speaking, and honestly just the knowledge part. This is something else my pastor was talking about here recently, that there's been, I don't know, since 20th century or so, more of a push in the Christian like side of things, that okay, I've got God, and God loves me, God saved me, I've got the Bible, I don't really need anything else. And sadly, a lot of Christians don't even I don't even need to read the Bible. Like I've already been saved, like I'm good to
Mm-hmm.
go. And it's almost like an anti knowledge, anti learning, intellectual uh,
Yeah.
mindset, which I I find very damaging. One, just spiritually, if we truly believe this is God's word, like why would we not
Mm.
want to read that more and learn it more? And if you think of, you gave all these examples of different leaders and political leaders that have used scripture as influence and have even just scripture in and of itself uses these uh, different type of persuasive type of ways of communicating, and even other books, other theologians that are so intelligent, and for us to take like an anti-intellectual stance, not only is silly for ourselves but makes us less persuasive, and we're certainly not persuading other people to believe in Christian beliefs or freedom for that matter. I find that very sad, and I do hope that that mentality changes in our generation.
Yeah, hopefully, but things go in cycles, so I think it will. It's always like history goes in cycles from one extreme to the other. So I'm confident it will at some time, just a matter of how long. So, um, but I do agree with you that having that knowledge and like you said, reading other things shows you, especially like the King James Bible and or versions like that. It just gives you those techniques that you get exposed to and almost you start using subconsciously if you really read it a lot. Just like I talked about those leaders from the past that were influenced by it. So I think that's important, really, to go back to the original source, even if it's even if you read just half an hour or an hour a day, it makes a big difference in the long run.
Well, Michael, I think we covered all sorts of really important things, and I hope that that your presentation and just talking about persuasion just in general, but particularly for those that are listening that are Christian or really looking for just freedom in general and the culture to be about. Don't just rely on the facts or your beliefs alone. Like let's find ways to be persuasive and to use these techniques that work, because if you're not using them, somebody else is, and they may not share the same values as you. So Michael, I really do appreciate you presenting this, and I think it's something a lot that the audience can benefit from.
Thanks. And yeah, if you want more information, just go to speakingforfreedom.com and I'll be glad to send you the slides if you want to look at those more in detail. I know it was a bit rushed. Don't have a lot of time today, but you can delve into this and spend hours learning about it. But I really appreciate your time this morning and just getting the word out and helping people be more persuasive.
Absolutely. So I'll have Michael's website down in the show notes, as well as his book and email. All that stuff will be down in the show notes. So definitely give that a look down there and email him if you would like that, the slides that he presented today. Thanks again for being on, and thank you to everyone that listened in today. And we will catch you on the next episode.